So, dear delegates, if we are going to be bold enough to call a plenary session the SDG Power Hour, then we're going to have to get somebody really influential to anchor it. Like somebody really influential, somebody like Melissa Fleming, the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Global Communications. That would be a big get. I don't even know if she would be available. Melissa, how did you make time? Oh, we are so honored. Melissa Fleming.
For this Leaders Summit and to have a chance to chat with you, Femi, and also to address this amazing audience here. So yeah, really happy to be here.
I'm looking forward to the lineup, Melissa. Over to you.
Great, thanks so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I just was introduced. I'm Melissa Fleming, and I'm the Under Secretary General for Global Communications at the UN, which means I lead communications for the United Nations around the world. And so it is really a great pleasure to host a special segment of the UN Global Compact Leaders Summit. And as Femi just said, also known in the wonderful formulation as the SDG Power Hour. And today is the opportunity for you to hear more about the Sustainable Development Goals. What actually do they mean in practical terms, and how you in the business and innovation worlds can play your part to help us achieve them. So I will be in conversation with 3 senior officials from across the UN system, all of whom are dynamic women leaders, and each of whom has a different perspective. First up will be Rosemary Calibata, who is the Deputy Director in the UN Development Coordination Office, also known as UNDP. Then we hear from Agnes Kalibata, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy to the 2021 Food Systems Summit. And finally, from Usha Rao-Monari, the Associate Administrator of the UN Development Program. I will now turn to Rosemary Calibata. Good afternoon, Rosemary, and thanks so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Melissa. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great. Let me start by asking you a question. How has the United Nations in recent years changed in the way it promotes and supports development around the world?
Thanks, Melissa, and it's such a great opportunity to be here. As you know, the Development Coordination Office is seeing through one of the most incredible set of reforms to help the UN development system work together better. And as corporate leaders can appreciate, sometimes a major restructuring is needed to ensure that an organization is fit for purpose to deliver on its objectives. And what objectives are we talking about? The most fantastic set of goals ever that all member states of the United Nations signed up to in 2015, known as the Sustainable Development Goals. And they represent the best of our thinking about how to help ensure that when economies and countries advance, that development is enduring even in the face of crises, even in the face of pandemics. And that requires an attempt to look at the economy, but also with the societies and with the environment in an integrated and inclusive way. And the reforms, therefore, are about getting the different parts of the UN development system, which is over 30 different entities ranging from the development program to the children's organization, to the environment program, to the trade organization, to work together to bring the best of their capacities, technical resources, expertise to help countries in very different settings. That requires organizational change, it requires cultural change, it requires an alignment of incentives, of programming instruments and tools. And that is the part that the Development Coordination Office is entrusted with, ensuring a new generation of leaders that can truly help countries in their specific settings with the kind of policy and financing solutions that will enable them to move closer and faster towards the Sustainable Development Goals.
No, thanks. No, thanks so much, Rosemary. I think it's really important what you said about the importance of continuing to plug away at promoting development, even when the world is in crisis. Very often when we're in crisis, we forget about the need for development. And if we were better developed around the world, we would not be in such crisis. So I think that's really great to see. I wonder how can, because our audience today is business leaders, if you can talk a bit about the role of the private sector globally and locally, and how this works in practical terms.
So, you know, it's such an important question because for too long, the United Nations has been seen to be very introverted. Last year, we had a leading public health expert, Laurie Jarrett, come and talk to the resident coordinators, the heads of the UN at the country level. And what she said to them is, you need to stop looking at yourselves and you need to look outside the UN to bring the best of the knowledge of the solutions that are out there. Because I can assure you, that the big corporations, private sector, whole swaths of society are moving at much faster pace than you are. But what the UN can do is really help convene, bring them all to a table together with policy leaders from government to come up with what we call Sdg Aligned Solutions. There are so many examples. If in Kenya, the country team has set up a partnership platform which works with the government, which works with rich countries to really source in expertise to help tackle, for example, maternal mortality. And they have actually succeeded in reducing maternal mortality by a significant portion. In Sri Lanka, there are conversations happening under the leadership of the resident coordinator, but with the country team, to think through what does it mean for the country to become an ethical IT destination, or how can women refugees navigate the job market as the Global Compact, in fact, is doing in Brazil, working closely together with the UN. It is really important that with the reform, the resident coordinators are tasked with shepherding this whole of society agenda. The SDGs are not about the government, it's not about the UN. It is really about bringing all sectors of society together to work towards a common cause, sharing the best of the data, the best of the technologies, the best of the analytical capacities that exist across sectors. And we know that in the brave new world we are in, and I was going to say post-COVID, but we can't really say post, unfortunately. But the pandemic has taught us that development is no good if it is not inclusive. Development is not sustainable if it isn't green. We're struggling with the crisis today, but we need the capacities, we need the foresight, we need the data, we need the technologies to help all people to participate in the benefits of economic growth without destroying the one planet we have, and to ensure that countries can benefit from the kinds of economic transformations that rich countries have enjoyed for so long. And so the business capabilities in the areas of data, digitalization, green technologies, new media, being able to hone into target audiences or particular localities, their specific needs, that represents a level of knowledge, agility, and customization that we critically need when we are talking about the SDGs.
No, that's great. I think that's an inspiring way to get people here in the audience to contribute. I wonder, though, of course, when we promote the SDGs, we're not only asking for the private sector and businesses to contribute their knowledge, their data, but we're also asking businesses to live and breathe and be part of the SDGs themselves. Would you like to comment on that? I mean, what role does a business have in kind of walking the talk of the SDGs?
You know, I think there's obviously a lot of important work that goes with environmental and social governance, corporate responsibility, and many businesses, many big parts of business are actually trying to think about their corporate responsibilities, social responsibilities, in addition to the profit motive that galvanizes their innovation and abilities. And we have seen that businesses have so much to contribute, and the UN, especially in the response to the COVID pandemic, has been partnering very effectively with them. So, for example, with schools closing and mothers out of work, they have had to be able to partner together, as they did in Azerbaijan, for example, the government, the UNICEF, and Microsoft on helping with remote learning facilities. There's been a huge lift to protect workers and sectors that has been spearheaded by the UN, but a number of partnerships were realized with the private sector, whether it is Brazil, for example, partnering with the Global Compact local network with a beverage company to produce alcohol-based sanitizer bottles that were donated to public hospitals. But you know, this is the response to the pandemic. But ultimately, what the pandemic has taught us and what we see the opportunity for is the enormous amounts of financing, public and private, that is going into the effort to have recovery. But what is that recovery towards? It has to be towards a more inclusive economy than we had before the pandemic. It has to be towards a greener economy than we had before the pandemic. It has to be about a truly inclusive digital economy than we had before the pandemic. So while the pandemic is one shock, it's a major global shock that galvanized us, there can be others around the corner. There have been others in the past. And perhaps more than ever, with businesses, but also businesses joined up with civil society, with governments, with the United Nations, it's an opportunity to pool the best of our resources, the best of our capabilities, the best of our financing for common cause, because it is about not just short-term profitability, but longer-term sustainability. I'm confident, Melissa, that we have the solutions. We even have the financing. They're just not aligned because we speak different languages. We speak with different terminology. We speak with different audiences and with different timeframes. And I see the wonderful part of the United Nations is being able, country by country, locality by locality, to help build those bridges so that we can foster these kinds of partnerships that will give us hope, certainly, but also hope for my children and for the next generation overall.
Indeed, that is the unique and the important role of the United Nations. Rosemary, thank you so much for enlightening us. It was really inspiring to hear from you and to hear that there is so much hope if we adopt the all of society approach to development that Rosemary outlined, and really take this as an inspiration, this awful crisis that we've all gone through, to build a better world. Thank you very much, Rosemary. And let's hear now from our two other speakers, both of whom I talked to last week. The first up is Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy to the 2021 Food Systems Summit. Let's find out what she has to say. Joining me is Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy to the 2021 Food Systems Summit. Agnes is responsible for organizing this summit, which will bring together the world's countries in September to try to transform the way the world produces, consumes, and thinks about food. Agnes, welcome. Let me start by asking you, though, a personal question. You spent 35 years in a refugee camp in Uganda. What role did food play for your life then, and how have you seen that role transition to what it is today?
Yeah, so thank you, Melissa, for having me again, and thank you for those remarks. Yes, I really lived the best part of my life in a refugee camp, and really it was like when my family came to get to the refugee camp, it was like being thrown in the middle of nowhere. And the only thing that was available was the land that UNHCR had secured for my family to live on. So with the land, my family and my community started producing food and using that food, of course, to be for a means of living. And then later, my dad figured out that he could produce food and sell to neighbors and be able to upgrade and buy cows and really be able to have a decent living and be able to send us to school, at least primary school, until later I had the opportunity to get a scholarship from UNHCR and be able to go back to go to secondary school. But what happened in that period of time, when my family farmed so that they could live, when my family farmed so that they could have a livelihood, I came to appreciate the role of food, not just as a means of feeding people and having a healthy life, but really to appreciate the role it has in people's lives as a way of income, as a way of ensuring that they have a livelihood, as a way of surviving everything else that they work with. So really, my life was shaped by that early thinking. And when I went to school and I later ended up in an agricultural department and later ended up in the CGIR where I worked for some time, I came to realize that my parents didn't have to struggle the way they did to produce just enough to feed us, or to produce just enough to be able to sell a little bit more. They are actually technologies that the rest of the world was already using to be able to improve their yields. There are markets that my parents could have been part of, that I realized that we were actually locked out of all of that. Whether it's how to increase yields, whether it is how to access markets and be part of a vibrant economy. Yet, food is one of the largest industries in the world, but we were locked out of that. So that recognition, realization, really built something in me that I really have to come out and be able to support farmers like my dad was a farmer, so that they just don't have to survive. They can thrive. That farming can be a business that helps them thrive. So I've spent my life basically until now working on that vision of farmers, it's smallholder farmers like my dad can actually thrive instead of surviving.
I recall you told me that your dad was actually a farmer by necessity. I believe he was a doctor before, but that's an interesting point. And that you have such an amazing story, you know, coming. I think it's just maybe just stick with the refugee experience for a minute, because Uganda was somewhat unique in that it did allow refugees to have a piece of land, whereas in other refugee situations, the refugees are completely dependent on the kind of handouts of international humanitarian organizations. So what kind of agency did you learn from that experience?
So in terms of just trying to understand, if I link it to what we are doing now from a food systems perspective, in terms of trying to understand how people's lives can shift. I mean, we already know what needs to be done. We don't have to wait for anything to get people's lives to move. But there are so many things that need to be done, from supporting smallholder farmers to be able to get yields that can transform their lives. And those things need to be invested in by governments, by private sector. Those are very urgent needs, because there are people that are living out of mainstream economies, mainstream livelihoods, whose lives could transform, but we are not doing it because we are not investing in the right places. So that is one of the things that really, I think needs to be addressed. The basis of inequities that are associated with smallholder farming really are not real. They shouldn't be there. These people should not be among the poorest in the world. But the way we've built our food systems is such that they are actually left out, because they are left out of markets. We've built our food system so that markets flow from one direction to another direction, irrespective of what is needed or what's not needed. So let me give you an example. Here in Africa, we import $55 billion worth of food. But we also have farmers who have nowhere to put food, who basically can't have no reason to invest in food because there's no incentive, there are no markets. So our food system has really been built to provide a lot of food for the world. We have a lot of food to the extent that we are wasting a lot of it, to the extent that, again, we've built all these inequities in our system, to the extent that we are taking away value from food instead of adding value to food. That's basically, that's how I look at it. When I look at the processing that we are doing to food and the fact that instead of adding value and nutrition, it is leading to all sorts of obesity. So to me, we are actually taking away value from food. So all these things have happened. And the urgent thing here is we really need to address the question of, are our food systems fit for purpose? Is this the type of food systems we need to be having? Which then leads to the question of why the Secretary General launched the Food System Summit. And there are so many other questions which we can go into around climate, around biodiversity.
And I do want to go into that too. So let's take, we need to unpack all of the elements of what you said, but maybe let's take everyone back to when you were Minister of Agriculture in Rwanda. You went from a young refugee girl to getting your PhD in Kampala, to then becoming Minister of Agriculture in Rwanda. And I believe what you introduced at that time was quite transformative, but then the effects of climate change happened. Can you just tell us that story?
Yeah, so I actually did my first degree in Makerere University, but I did my PhD in the US at the University of Massachusetts with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation. So, and of course, working with IITA. So what I learned from all that, like I said earlier, is that farmers can actually improve their yields. And it was meeting my dream, already meeting my dream halfway, because again, my dream was that smallholder farmers' lives can change. So when I became a minister, I had the opportunity now to really bring this whole science that I had been seeing from a CGIAR perspective, from coming from an institution like the University of Massachusetts perspective, and really all that excitement that I had brought together, and then having the opportunity to now see policy, have the means to be able to translate some of that into policy and be able to reach people and be able to have the support of my government and have investments to do and reach millions of people in ways I could only dream of. So this actually happened, and I saw this happen and transform people's lives. And even in my role today, work I'm doing at AGRA, I see that this trying to happen in other parts of the continent. Now, what I was not prepared for is that after creating this expectation of we can actually get out of poverty, us smallholder farmers can actually start getting out of poverty. I was not prepared for climate change. I was not prepared for just the erosion the feeling of walking in a farmer's field after he's planted a good crop and everything just disappears in less than 2 weeks of no rain, and he's wondering what happened. This is the time we're supposed to be having rains, but everything just goes dry. So by the time we came to understand that climate change was happening and it was real, farmers had really started losing nearly everything they had. Their capital bases are very small. So losing everything is not extremely difficult, right? It's based on land, it's based on rain-fed agriculture, it's based on a very small capital base. So definitely 2 seasons of one after the other of climate change was enough to take away everything. Then I started thinking, what does one do? I actually felt helpless. I was in a situation where I felt helpless. I thought we had figured it out. Now, when the opportunity of the Food System Summit came, I said, for me, it became personal. Being a special envoy in the Food System Summit was about going out there and taking the urgency of the need to change things from a climate change perspective, the need to address the challenges these farmers are facing on the ground, the need to address climate change, the need to address what we are doing on our planet that is destroying people's lives. Many times whose view, who are not in our view, who we don't see, but their lives are being destroyed every day. I just felt like this is a perfect platform for me to be able to address this challenge. that we must do something about climate change because it's impacting people that don't even know how it started or what's happening around them. It's taking us backwards millions of years. And so that's really how personal climate change is, and the fact that addressing it is extremely important.
So you have the small farmers who you got to know in mind, you increased their yield, and then the rains didn't come. So then you have the huge issue of climate change, and then you flagged that there are things wrong with the markets for small farmers. Africa is importing so much of its food when it could be producing so much of its own food locally. What is it, if you could change and you could achieve at this summit, 3 things, what would it be to address these issues?
Yeah, so right now, the most important thing all of us need to understand is that producing food now is a major cost to us in terms of all the things I talked about, but actually it doesn't have to be so. It has huge opportunities for business. People talk about $45 billion. I mean, $45 trillion, no, 4.5, sorry. People talk about $4.5 trillion in new businesses that could be created if we transitioned our food system. So for me, if I could do 3 things, one is to get private sector to engage on investing in food systems in new ways that are compatible to producing enough food for people, but also compatible with ensuring the continuity of our environment and planet for the future. That would be number 1. And there are ways to do it. Number 2 is our governments to recognize that we've run out of time, how we can use our planet. It's one thing that is an opportunity is being able to transition our food system now, not tomorrow, now, to new ways of doing business, new ways of farming, to rehabilitate what has been damaged, to start reducing the impact we've had, so that it doesn't start escalating into something that is not reversible. So we do have an opportunity now for us to reverse the impact that we are having. Number 3, we have a lot of inequity in our systems, and there's something we can do about it. We have so much in our environment, we have so much between all of us. Being able to invest in improving equity and ensuring that if a smallholder farmer is farming to supply a value chain, that they have a decent living wage in that value chain. It's not outside our means. It's just building it in our ability to do business. It's just good business for all of us. So the fairness and equity of farming system would be my number 3.
Thank you, Agnes. I think that makes it really clear, and it is a bit of a call to action to our audience here, to the business leaders who are taking part in this event. And I just wonder, because you also mentioned before the issue of food processing, so the quality of food and the result that has had on human health, issues like obesity becoming epidemic as a result of modern food systems designed for convenience, but not necessarily for health. How does this fit in your kind of wish list of transforming food systems?
So we need to look at this at several levels. Excuse me. We need to look at this at several levels. We need to understand that there's responsibility here. It's difficult to manage that as governments, as member states that are responsible for people's lives, that we actually don't have policies in place. Now that we know what needs to be done, we don't have policies in place to check what impacts people's health, right? A lot of people, like I talked about equity and the inequities in our system, a lot of people will eat what is available to them. So for me, it's not enough to label food, because the people that are eating that food have no other means sometimes. It's not always a choice. We are labeling, assuming that everybody has a choice. But sometimes the people that are eating the cheapest food are not eating it because it's a choice. They're eating it because it's the most affordable that they can get. We need to put the right food on the table. So governments need to understand responsibility there, but also businesses need to understand responsibility here. So we can't have 2 billion people every year suffering from obesity, being the number one cause of death among people, and we still live with it like it means nothing. It's huge responsibility on our part, and we need to do something about it. So that's a major transition that needs to happen in our food system. And governments, private sector, all of us have a responsibility. It's not enough to inform consumers and pass the buck to consumers. We need to do something about it.
Thank you. And if you had a message to the food producers of the world, what would it be?
I mean, my favorite people in the world are food producers, especially the ones, the smallholder farmers that I grew up among, that I grew up with, and the ones that I work to serve every day. I call them my favorite people because they work so hard and they're so invisible in the system, and they suffer a lot. So they're doing a lot, but there's also, they have a role and responsibility. And when I talk about people showing up at the summit, one of the things I say is how producers show up. I want them to show up with their heads high, being able to tell the world what they're able to do for us, because they are custodians of our environment. They do a lot to ensure that our environment is sustained. We need to support them. So I want them to understand their responsibility, because they do have a responsibility to ensure that we can leave our land to our children, and many of them work very hard to do that. I want them to understand what is at stake and to be part of ensuring that we pass on this land in a good state. But I also want them to know that this food system summit is about trying to find help, to support them, so that they are not isolated, so that they are not working alone, so that they are not suffering from climate change alone, because after all, they even don't know how climate change happened.
True. And if you were then addressing your message to the big food producers and processors of the world, what would that message be?
I would say that working with this summit, we've been trying hard. We've tried a lot to try to create trust among people, among us. I understand very well how trust can be easily broken, how there's very little trust in our environment. We are trying to rebuild that by ensuring that there are all sorts of dialogue and conversations happening. And the huge opportunity here is businesses have an opportunity to look at new ways of doing business, of innovating around where our world is going, because the way we are doing business is not going to be sustainable. So the biggest opportunity now is to start looking at how to invest for people and for planet. And the time has never been better than now. So I would encourage them and tell them the opportunities now, grab it and start thinking green and invest green.
Agnes, thank you very much for sharing with us your vision, and all the best for this such an important summit that's going to take place in September. And I hope you get all the support you need to make your vision a reality.
Thank you. Take it to the people, take it to businesses, take it to everybody, and help them understand what is at stake. That's all we want here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Usha Rao-Monari, who is the Associate Administrator of the UN Development Program, UNDP. Let's hear from Usha. It's my pleasure now to speak with Usha Rao-Monari, who earlier this year became the Associate Administrator at the United Nations Development Program. Usha, welcome.
Thank you very much, Melissa.
For those of you who don't already know, can you just give us a brief kind of 101 introduction to UNDP? How does it work within the system, and what is its role in rolling out and promoting the Sustainable Development Goals?
Thank you. It would be my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me to this important session, Melissa. I look forward to talking to you. The first question is a really important one. Many people know about the UN. Many people know about the UNDP. But I think it's always good to remind people what it is that we do. So we at UNDP are the UN's lead agency on international development. We work in 170 countries and territories. And our goal is really to eradicate poverty and reduce inequality through what we do and how we do it and so on. We stand behind creating integrated solutions in the face of very complex and increasingly complex, unfortunately, development challenges. In a nutshell, I would say the way I describe UNDP is the following. It's a trusted partner to our member countries. We help countries develop policies, capacities, and resilience to achieve their sustainable development goals. And the way we do this, and this I'm particularly proud of, and I knew this even before I joined UNDP, we have a highly decentralized footprint and presence in these countries. We operate with a neutrality of approach. And we, most importantly, in many ways, we have an active and continuing presence in the most extreme crisis scenarios. Frequently, people say, we're the last man standing in very, very difficult situations. All those create the trust that we enjoy with our partners. And in terms of partners, we have a broad range of partners, of course, governments, but also private sector, civil society, other stakeholders and players in the economic system that come together to help countries achieve their development goals. You also asked about SDGs. Well, I mean, I think UNDP is the home, if you will, almost alongside the overall UN system for the SDGs. I mean, and as far as I'm concerned, SDGs are the universal agenda for sustainable development pathways for the world, for the forthcoming future. I also think SDGs, and sometimes when I say this, people look at me and wonder what I'm saying, but I'm going to say it here, Melissa, which is, I think it's the opportunity map taken as a whole, and with their individual differences, they are the opportunity map for the world for the coming years. It is the SDGs encourage systemic thinking, connecting the dots, if you will, a more integrated and comprehensive approach to development rather than the siloed one we've come to look at around the world so far. And in order to do this, we've come up under the administrator's vision with a strategy which is comprised of 6 signature solutions, as we call them, if you will. And these are basically poverty eradication, governance, energy access, gender equality, resilience, and of course, environmental sustainability. And we do this through a set of enablers, including finance, including digitalization, innovation, and so on. Just one example before I go off this question that you asked me. During the pandemic, we put together with our partners a very clear offer. And the offer was the following: digital solutions to improve vaccine delivery, for example. Strengthen data and analysis for vaccine equity so that people knew where the vaccines were going. And renewable energy solutions for various health facilities. We deployed nearly $1 billion, actually, to 170 countries and territories and helped train, and this is a particular point of pride, helped train almost 300,000 workers, health workers around the world. And all of that came because of our ability to be on the ground and the neutrality of approach.
Yeah, well,
stop there.
Indeed, yeah. Well, you have offices, in practically every country in the world, people on the ground who are helping countries to, create this kind of SDG, just to integrate it really in policies and in planning. And I think so it's not just these kind of 17 goals. And I think you just spoke about how integrated everything is. Like, you can't really just achieve one goal and then expect the society to get better. And we've seen with COVID-19 how interconnected everything is, and how much of an impact a global pandemic has had on what we were trying to achieve with the goals, particularly in the areas of inequality, where we've seen COVID-19 expose a lot of what we were trying to achieve. Equality in in income equality, in gender equality, in the digital divide and education. And so maybe you could just talk just a little bit about how you've seen COVID-19 as a setback for achieving the goals, but also perhaps as an opportunity. I mean, we have this slogan, depending on how you'd like to say it, it's either recover better or build back better. And everybody keeps saying we still have the SDGs as our blueprint for a better world.
Thank you. Yes, and I couldn't have articulated it better than you, Melissa, because the pandemic, if you will, created a situation that none of us expected. None of us. And as far as I'm concerned, the pandemic is a very simple thing. It was a simple virus, maybe not so simple, but a virus that essentially led to a health crisis, that then led to an economic crisis, that then led to a social crisis. And all of those collapsed on each other to bring us to where we are today. So what has that done as far as the SDGs is concerned? Well, you're right. It has set back the progress on SDGs. It has not set back the passion for the SDGs, though. That has just been intensified. People realize that looking at those 17 SDGs together, systemically in some ways, will help us get back on the path and maybe even move faster. Maybe in some strange way, the pandemic, while setting us back a bit, has also accelerated our intent to achieve the 2030 agenda. And we are in the last decade of action, and somehow this might be the push we all need to look at it. And when coming from the private sector, I look at the SDGs, I look at what is needed by way of global development, and I am looking at it differently. I'm sure you've seen it in the financial sector, and the industrial sector, manufacturing sector, private sector, and other non-traditional actors in development are looking at development and saying, I'd like to play. I'd like to play a role. How do I do that? So as far as
that, let me interrupt you there, because you do come from the private sector. You've spent your whole career. I mean, we at the UN, it's kind of obvious that we work day in and day out to try to create a better world in the interests of human dignity and the betterment of people's lives. Whereas the private sector is often thought of as, I wouldn't say, less altruistic, let's put it that way. But I have seen, and it's been really exciting, at many occasions, CEOs walking around with SDG pins. What is it about the SDGs that is exciting for the private sector? And, is it not just because they believe it's the right thing to do? Is it the consumers who are demanding it? Or is it because it's in their financial self-interest?
I think, that's a wonderful question. And I think, every private sector CEO has debated it in his or her mind and said, why am I so concerned now than I was, let's say, a decade ago? And I think it's the realization, not just because of the pandemic, but because of a number of things that are happening around us, that everything is interconnected. No man, no company is an island. No one can be isolated from a larger systemic effect. And I think that is what is creating more of an urgency, if I may put it that way, amongst non-traditional actors. And here I talk about the private sector, but there's others as well who haven't participated as fully as they could in the development paradigm. So I think that here, the urgency comes from the fact that we are in the last decade of action. The Sustainable Development Goals have given us a blueprint, if I may use your word, or at least a set of goals that we can aspire to. And third, if we work, and that's for me the most key thing, if we work with institutions like the UNDP and other UN entities, we can actually not only understand what the task before us is, but we can aggregate and combine our skill sets to provide better solutions. And I think that's where the private sector and other non-traditional actors are coming in. And I think as far as the UNDP is concerned, I'm proud to say we have put in place a lot of sort of platforms, multi-stakeholder platforms, and so on, which I'm happy to go over with you to encourage business, private sector, financial sector to work with us.
Well, that's great, because I think that's often important that we see there's a lot of desire and willingness to work with the UN and to contribute. And very often, a business or a company just like, how do I call the UN? So it's great that UNDP has these mechanisms in place. But when you do get a company interested in perhaps investing in helping in development or in financing your programs, what do you say to them about what's in it for them?
So what's in it for them is, as it is for everybody, is global prosperity and dignity. And without those two things, it doesn't matter who you are or what kind of entity you are, you will not succeed in the long term. That is my true conviction on development, which is probably why I am here trying to help and, to support sort of the development pathways going forward. But to your point, when we work with companies, well, first of all, if I may, we have a number of sort of platforms that I won't go into too much detail, that the UNDP has. I mean, because we work in 170 countries and territories, we have a huge and ground up perspective on issues and solutions. It's very unlike anywhere else I've ever been, where we don't have enough of an on-the-ground perspective. So we hypothesize, or we speculate, or and then we create solutions around that. At the UNDP, they actually have a totally ground-up knowledge. They have the partnerships, if you will, in country to figure out what the issues are and where the solutions might come from. We therefore have a good and strong expertise in public-private partnerships. I don't mean necessarily just the infrastructure type. I mean in everything, whether it's gender equality, whether it's governance, whether it's conflict prevention, recovery, whatever. We do look to see how we bring a diversity of partners together. But more specifically, I'll give you some examples. We have our International Center for Private Sector and Development, like in Istanbul, for example, that hosts 4 key and quite successful multi-stakeholder platforms. One is called the Connecting Business Initiative, which you might know all these, but I'm just saying it so just to put it on the table. The Connecting Business Initiative, which we have with Usha, for example, provides an entry point for private sector actors, and let me just call them non-traditional actors, but private sector actors as well, to engage in disaster risk reduction, for example, or emergency preparedness and recovery, and areas like that, which otherwise, these entities will say, I don't know what to do. I get it. I know there's an issue, but I don't know what to do. Where, Connecting Business Initiative helps. We also have the Philanthropy Platform, which brings together large, as you know, pools of money that lie in these philanthropic entities that is also looking for a way to engage in the development discourse and development process. We have something called the Business Call to Action, which enhances access to basic services and goods for the most vulnerable. And this is bringing the private sector in to provide services and goods. And finally, we have the Global Islamic Finance and Impact Investing Platform, which is really a very interesting one that brings together players interested in putting money at scale for impact. These 4 platforms are areas that the private sector can absolutely connect with us. We have a few others, which I'm kind of also proud of, if I may mention. We have the human rights due diligence self-assessment for companies, so this is basically in times of crisis like COVID, how are you doing as a company? And it's become very important for companies to use this tool to measure themselves. And finally, Melissa, the gender equality seal that we have, which is a very interesting tool. It's a global recognition for the establishment of gender equality and women's empowerment in their policies and programs of mainly private sector entities, but also for public institutions. And this has become a very, very telling mechanism where companies, public institutions, private institutions almost vie to get this seal to show that gender equality is something that is very front and center on their radar screens. So I think, I mean, there's many other, but these are the key things that come to my mind right now in terms of what we are doing to engage with the private sector. And just to finally answer, what does the private sector have in it? They get to participate in a process, in the development process or the sustainable development process that will help not only the most vulnerable, but will help them in terms of very important things such as supply chains, such as, you know, goods procurement, such as services procurement. And that's how the private sector is looking at it. For the financial sector, and I always make this distinction, there's the manufacturing industrial sector, then there's the financial sector. For them, it is also a way of deploying the huge pools of capital they have at their disposal into development in countries or, you know, in even subnational areas to increase development and therefore increase their own sort of ability to provide banking services, to provide other financial services. So is there a self-interest? Always. Is there an enlightened self-interest? Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think, yes, we need definitely self-interest, and we need much more enlightened self-interest and partnership with the private sector, because only with and in partnership will we ever be able to achieve the sustainable development goals. So I think just finally, if you could, you know, tell us one lesson that you have learned out of this pandemic, perhaps you personally, but also as UNDP, and, you know, how could this be, you know, something perhaps opportunistic or forward-looking for the future that you'd like to leave everyone with?
Thank you. That's, you know, I guess there's so many lessons one has learned, but I'm going to give you the lesson for me and then the lesson for an entity like the UNDP. The lesson for me, I already mentioned to you, which is simply that the knowledge and the absolute realization that something as small as this virus can create a health, economic, social crisis that has brought us all to a halt. And that for me was a big wake-up call to how to look at crises that may come upon us in the future. For UNDP, interestingly, what it taught us was the need for speed and agility of response, the need for aggregation of competencies and partnerships, and then the creation of a clear offer. We learned, very interestingly, that in crisis, it is not a competition between public and private. It's not a competition between profit and impact. It is a combined and coherent effort that will make the difference. So that's where we stand by way of lessons through all the work we're doing, SDG Impact, you know, various other things where we're involved. Those are the lessons that we learned. And I think that the partnership aspect that you mentioned, Melissa, is particularly important because nobody can do it alone.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you very much, Usha, for enlightening us about UNDP, giving us inspiration for the Sustainable Development Goals, even as we emerge from this crisis. Their relevance as a blueprint for a better world has been proven, and they're still the best model. So thanks for the work you do, and thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Thanks for inviting me.
Three very fascinating perspectives on building a better world for all, and also how business is essential to that. Thank you for joining us today. We hope that these conversations have inspired you to work hand in hand with the United Nations and to develop better and more integrated solutions to the critical global challenges we're facing today. Back to you, Femi.
Thank you very much, Melissa. So, dear delegates, the Leaders Summit 2021 began almost 9 hours ago. I kicked it off. And I've been watching all 9 hours. And now I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, and then he's going to hand it over to his co-host. And then 26 hours later, we'll be done. The theme for this year is the year of ambition. And what we've seen so far really really sets the scene really for that. I'm going to bring in Dan Thomas. He is the Chief of Communications and Strategic Events for the UN Global Compact. And just going to recap some of the things that stood out for me, Dan. Do you mind if I mention your fireside chat panel? Is that okay?
Well, if you must.
All right, it wasn't you, actually. It was the guests. They were great. Let me give you some of the feedback, because I, like you, are all over engagement. So I just jotted down what I was watching as you were having this fireside chat. Selena Smith, for instance, and just to remind people, Dan, do you want to remind people what the topic was? Human rights and
racial equity in the private sector in the United States.
Yeah, and racial justice. Selena Smith says, very real talk. Romana Houston, good point, Grady Cosby. Business must do more than just cut a check. I like this one from Titus Burrow, who was again watching your fireside chat, Dan. So inspirational and to the point, understanding the word racism and calling it as it is. Did you know that you were actually moderating such a powerful panel? How did it feel when you were doing it?
Absolutely. I mean, with that kind of leadership that we had on that panel, it was clearly going to be a really, really interesting conversation and a really timely conversation, not only for this country, but for the whole world. So, I think that was one of the panels that really resonated with our audience, Femi.
And this country being the United States, because where Dan is and where I am, we're in the United States, but it doesn't really matter, because on the Leaders Summit, we're global, we're all over the world, all places, all the time. But certainly parts of North America was awake during that fireside chat, and it really resonated. I got the feeling, Dan, that if people were in the same room as you, there would have been definite applause lines. Something else that jumped out at me, Adam Met, he did a 15-minute tight, I'm going to call it a tight set because he's a musician, he's also a humanitarian, he's also a PhD candidate for human rights. And what he said about using his knowledge about the music business and how he uses his grassroots fan base to get people motivated. His pitch was, we know this works in music. We know the fans can drive action and activism. Why don't we apply what we know in music to making climate change happen, climate action happen? That stood out. And it was only 15 minutes, but he looked directly at the camera and it went straight through me. Dan, then you would have noticed this. This was Sandra Ogiambo. She is the executive director of the UN Global Compact. I love the way that she ninja-like appeared all over the place. She was interviewing. She was doing an address. She was at the beginning. She was all in different places. It was almost like the Oscars with change of outfits, but with meaning, right? If the Oscars had changed the world, that is what Sandra was doing. So that was bit I really loved. But it must be really difficult for you as chief comms to look at something this giant and not to have a heart attack. How do you do that? How do you not do that?
Well, as you can tell, Femi, we're very ambitious at the UN Global Compact. We have a big mission to work on, and less than 10 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
So we can't rest on our laurels. We have to think big, we have to be ambitious, and we have to drive action. And that's our mission. And Sandra is there leading the charge as our chief advocate.
I wouldn't be surprised if she just popped up behind you and she's like, there again. Here she is again. One last thing, and this took us this is almost 9 hours ago. We had two prime ministers. So we had the Prime Minister of the Republic of Korea, Prime Minister of Jamaica, and the President of Singapore. And what I noticed that they weren't just doing standard opening remarks. They felt more like keynotes, call to action, and they grabbed me. And they made me pay attention. And it wasn't just UN protocol, because we know at the beginning of official events, we have to have certain opening remarks. It didn't feel like that this time. It felt like something special and different, Dan. What did you ask them to do?
I think you're absolutely right. And we're engaging leaders, not just heads of state, but CEOs, leaders of the United Nations. We had the Secretary General. We'll have the Deputy Secretary General joining us for the closing remarks at the end. We've had some other heads of UN agencies join us, heads of civil society. We had Sharon Burrow from the International Trade Union Congress.
I love that. Sharon Burrow she's a great panelist. I know her as a great panelist. Whenever we have Sharon Burrow on a panelist, she's the Secretary General of the IUTC. You've got a great panel because she likes to what's the word? Flip the script a little bit. She won't just sit there and go, blah, 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 blah. And it was really nice to see her moderate. Right?
Absolutely. Because
she makes
change
good
it up a
trouble.
little bit.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
And I think, as you say, this is a global forum where people really are getting into the subject matter. There's nothing, there's no formalities. You've actually led the way very well in that, Femi. You've created an atmosphere for real conversations about some really important issues. And I think that's come across really well in the first 9 hours of this summit. We've got 17 hours to go, and our job will be to keep the energy that you've created going for the next 17 hours as we pass the baton from the East Coast of the United States. You're in Washington and I'm in New York. We're going to pass it on. I'm going to pass it on later to Australia and then to James Chow in Asia. And from there, it'll pass to Europe and then it'll come all the way back to us in New York. So thank you so much for everything you've done to lead this off. What are your impressions? How do you think we've done so far? What parting words have you got as you hand over for the next 17 hours, Femi?
Keep thinking ambitiously. Live up to the title, live up to the theme. Dan, you're taking care of the next couple of hours. I'm handing over to you. What should we expect?
Well, we've got a packed program coming up, as you can imagine. We'll be breaking now in the main plenary stage. There are continuing sessions in the breakout rooms and on the growth and innovation stage. And then I'll be back in a couple of hours to hand over to our colleagues in Australia for another important session around the SDGs. And from there, we'll keep chasing the sun around the world until the morning back in the East Coast of the United States.
Are you going to go to bed?
Femi, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Dan, just one question. Journalist has to ask one last question. Are you going to go to sleep, Dan?
Absolutely not. I'm determined to stay up
I want to
all
see you
night.
in 26 hours' time. How slick you're looking in 26 hours' time. I'm going to stay up.
That may be another thing. All right. Well,
thank you so much. It's been an honor being your MC delegate. I will hand you over to Dan Thomas. You're in very good hands.
Well, thank you, Femi. And as I say, I'll be back in a couple of hours and we'll resume the plenary stage then. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sticking with us. And thank you for looking around the platform, joining in the one-on-one chats, seeing what's on the growth and innovation stage. And I'll be back in a couple of hours. Thank you.